speaking to Daniel, he gives Daniel a word of comfort concerning Daniel's people. Let me see if I can drive that home before we develop this. Because that's all I'm really going to talk to you about today, is the rest that God has provided for his people. As far as Daniel could see, he looked out among his Hebrew brethren who were in Babylon, and he didn't see any rest. As far as Daniel was concerned, they were toiling. They were toiling in pagan idolatry. They were toiling in their natural Adamic sin. They were toiling in the darkness of God's providence. They were toiling in uncertainty. Do you know anything about that toil? Do you know anything about that toil? Do you know the toil of not knowing what God is up to? The toil of not knowing where you stand with God? The toil of not knowing when God's going to deliver you, if God's going to deliver you. Do you know anything about that toil? I want you to think about it for a moment, because really what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that I'm certain that if we know anything about it, we only know a little bit about this, and that is rest. We only know a little bit about resting. Now, right now, for you young folks who are just bundles of energy, my message is not really going to touch you. But for you old folk, you say, now tell me something about that rest. Because the word R-E-S-T sounds real good to me. And the older I get, the more it sounds good. Am I telling the truth? But there's a reason for that, and I want to make sure I drive this home. Now, the reason I give that caveat is because I know that our young people are smarter than that. They know how to take the shell of that fruit, that nugget of divine truth, even though it's not ready for them to eat, and store it away for the rainy day. Because you're going to be pulling this out in a few years when the Lord gets a hold of you and shakes your soul like he shook our soul and start calling you to himself, and you realize, Lord, I'm tired. I need you like my parents need you and my grandparents need you. And that might be at 17 years old. That might be at 19 years old. I was tired at 18 years old when God began to deal with me. You know, you can only run so long. Am I making some sense? You can only run so long. And the young people think they can run forever. Oh, Pastor, I got a good while to go. Not if the Spirit of God gets out at you, starts throwing things in your way, stumbling blocks in your way, hedges in your way, start putting potholes in the road. You'll start wanting to slow down, won't you? But right now, rest is not a big issue for young people. Rest is a huge issue for sinners. It's a huge issue for sinners. And the word rest is a magnanimous term with God. It's a magnanimous term with God. There is a rest for the people of God. I want you to get this. There's a rest for the people of God. Notice how Daniel opens up. It's in your outline. Point number 1. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city. Do you guys see that? That's what I mean. Now, I know it doesn't seem at the outset that that's what's being said, but I want to exercise your senses a little bit today. Literally, it is translated as we have it in our title, 70 sevens are determined for your people. That's the literal translation. Literally, more literally, is 70 70s. There will be a cutting off so that your people won't be always going through all this trouble. Now, let me see if I can build on that. It's one thing to go through trouble. It's another thing to know that there's an end coming to the trouble. Do you guys see that? And the angel is telling Daniel, all this trouble that your people are going through and will go through has an end. The Hebrew verb to cut off, which is spoken about several times in the book of Daniel, translated determined. It's God's providential point where he stops a thing. And so he's telling Daniel, this is all going to end at the end of 70 sevens. Now, why 70 sevens? Well, because the angel understood that Daniel was a Hebrew. And he understood that the language of sevens is the language that the Hebrew people have learned over the years from the time that God called them out of Egypt into the land of promise, and he revealed himself to them. Remember what I said earlier? God is known by the what? Judgments which he executes. And for the Hebrew people, when they were brought into covenant relationship with God, God set up tutoring systems by which they would learn the way God works and why God works. And he set up what we call repetitive cycle principles. Repetitive cycle principles. By the way, we operate out of those same things as God's creatures too. I'm going to explain that. We're just not aware of the repetitive cycle principles into which God has called us. The Hebrew phrase 77s is merely a redundant term. The Hebrew word sabuah or shibua is the number 7. Shibuim is the number 7 in the plural form. Shibua, shibuim. There are Shibua, Shibuims for the people of God. They would have understood that, Daniel would have understood rather, that God is dealing with his people in terms of cycles of 7. Literally is 70 sevens. Daniel understands now that the angel is telling Daniel that God is still being faithful to his covenant with his people. God hasn't so cut his people off that God has disregarded his covenant promises. As he speaks to Daniel, he's saying to Daniel, Daniel, remember the covenant. Remember the principles. Remember the tutoring. And I'm going to take you through that today because you need to know it. As we are dealing with the 77s, all we're dealing with in essence is the significance of the term. Now, in your English Bible, it's translated 70 what? Weeks. Isn't that right? 70 weeks are determined upon your people. But the word week is not literally the word. It's the word 7. You guys got that? It's in your outline. It's the word 7. And so we call 7 days in the week a week after 7 days. Isn't that right? We go day 1, day 2, day 3, day 5, day 6, day 7. And for us, 7 days is a what? Week. And then we start all over again. Well, who started that? God did. God started what we call the 7-day cycle. Again, in the Hebrew, it's not really week, but that's okay. We can translate it from the Hebrew that it's really sevens. I want you to hear the number 7. You guys hear the number 7? Sevens. It's very important for you to get that. The Hebrew mind would have understood the concept of the number 7. When we talk about the number 7, we recognize that the number 7 is a number of perfection.